and welcome to my channel Complementary Economics, and today's topic, supply side of macroeconomic equilibrium. One of the 6-mark question you have like this in this chapter: explain the supply side of macroeconomic equilibrium. Let's see the answer. First of all, we have to assume few of the things to prove supply side of macroeconomic equilibrium. The first kind of assumption what we have taken is price level is fixed. Otherwise, when price level is fixed, that means it is constant. Otherwise, there is no role of that. In this particular topic, supply side of macroeconomic equilibrium, we have to assume that price is fixed. In that case, we have to think that the price has no role to play. It is constant in this particular topic. And one more thing we have to concentrate here, that is GDP, aggregate supply, is equal to GDP. First of all, let me say it as GDP is equal to aggregate supply. What is aggregate supply here? Aggregate supply means the total goods what you have produced and supplied to the people. Aggregate, that means total, whole supply in the country in particular time period. GDP is the gross domestic product. So gross domestic product means in one particular year, like which is financial year, whatever the goods and services you have produced and in market value, that will be called as a GDP. So what is GDP? What is aggregate means? We have already studied in the second chapter of macroeconomics, that is national income accounting. So here it can be aggregate supply, GDP. They both move up and down. Both move up and down very smoothly. So as I told you already, GDP is equal to aggregate supply. Please do remember this. In future, we are going to talk about it. So here, as I told you, aggregate supply, it moves up and down. So why it is going to move up and down? Why aggregate supply is going to increase? Why it is going to decrease? Up means it is increasing, down means it is decreasing. Why aggregate supply is going to increase? Decrease. Why GDP is increasing or decreasing? That is because of unused resources of all types. That means in economy still so many resources are there which is completely unused. We did not use. If we use it, if we use any of the goods and services, optimum usage, so that time GDP is going to increase, aggregate supply is also going to increase. In case if I am not able to use the resources which is called as unused, we have resources in the economy, but right now in this time we did not use. Because of that, GDP is also less, aggregate supply is also less. That means if you are using more resources, more supply, more GDP. If you are using less of resources, that means less supply and less GDP. So that's why if you are using more resources, GDP is going to move upward. If you are using less resources, GDP is going to move downwards. As simple as that. So supply is equal to GDP, as I just told you. And here, so let's explain how exactly the supply curve is all about. In the previous videos of mine in this chapter, we already discussed about aggregate demand. So now the first thing what we have to discuss, what is aggregate supply and how it looks like. You can see here we have a x-axis and the y-axis. In the x-axis you have GDP, at the same time y is nothing but the income. So in the x-axis you have aggregate supply. The x-axis you have a aggregate supply, and here you can see the blue line which is moving towards the upward. So that is nothing but aggregate supply curve. The aggregate supply curve here always 45 degrees, because the aggregate supply and GDP easily move upward and downward. So that's the reason always aggregate supply stands for 45 degrees. So now you can see the green dotted line which is in point A, and it shows 1000 GDP, income. If GDP is 1000 rupees, I already told you in the last slide of mine, GDP is equal to aggregate supply. If GDP is for 1000 rupees, so then what will be the supply? Aggregate supply. Even supply will be 1000 rupees. This particular dotted line what you have here, point A to point B, it shows if GDP is 1000 rupees, supply will be equal to this. In this particular point where B point I am pointing, so there aggregate supply also stands for 1000. And let's talk about the next one. So I just told you it's a 45-degree line, and I just told you it is a supply curve is horizontal and the vertical coordinates. Next, now you have aggregate demand also, and you have aggregate supply curve also. Now you already know how aggregate demand looks like. If you want to know how aggregate demands looks like and how we're going to construct, so you have to see previous videos of mine of this particular chapter. So one is consumption function I have explained, next video I have explained about investment topic. So then combining that we said it's a aggregate demand. So this particular video only I have explained aggregate supply. So now let's see the equilibrium. So this is the x axis, this is the y axis. In the x axis you have GDP, otherwise income. In the y axis you have aggregate demand and the aggregate supply. The aggregate demand and aggregate supply, that is in the x axis. The first line what we constructed, that is the supply curve. Why it is supply curve? Because it is in the 45 degree, you can see here. The next line what we have, you can see that the next line what got it constructed, it is nothing but the demand curve, aggregate demand curve. So the supply curve and the aggregate demand curve, they both started intersecting each other. So you can see here point which is E. When demand curve and the supply curve, they both are going to intersect, that point is called equilibrium point. You can see here equilibrium. So alpha A always we have seen in the aggregate demand. So you can see that previous videos of mine, consumption video and the consumption function and the investment function, you will see how we got the alpha. So in this case, when supply, aggregate supply and the aggregate demand, they both are going to intersect, that point is called equilibrium. The E is nothing but the equilibrium point here. So that means what we can say is, through this, ex ante aggregate demand is equal to ex ante aggregate supply. So you can see here supply curve, aggregate supply curve is equal to aggregate demand. Which aggregate supply is this? Which aggregate demand is this? This is ex ante aggregate supply and ex ante aggregate demand. They both are going to intersect. We will get the point which is equilibrium. And this OY, this particular x axis, we have a income. Yeah, otherwise we can call it as GDP also. So I hope you understood what is macroeconomic supply is all about. Thank you so much. So please, if you really like my video, please subscribe and share. Thank you.